I used to think the worst thing that could happen to a person was losing someone they love. I was wrong. The worst thing is finding out that the people you trusted the most were the ones planning your downfall the whole time. And the strangest part, I found out on the one day I should have been the happiest girl alive. My name doesn't matter right now. What matters is what happened on the 23rd of March, in a house that used to feel like the safest place on earth. That house had my baby pictures on the wall. It had the mark on the kitchen door frame, where my father measured my height every birthday. It had the smell of my mother's cooking that I could recognize from 3 streets away. That house was supposed to be proof that I belonged somewhere. Instead, it became the place where I learned that blood doesn't always mean loyalty. Let me take you back a little. 6 months before that day, my grandfather passed away. He was the only person in that family who ever looked at me like I was worth something without expecting anything back. He used to say, "You are the one who will carry this family's name forward, not because you were born into it, but because you have the heart for it." I didn't understand what he meant then. I understood it later when it was too late to matter to him, but exactly on time to matter to everyone else. He left a will, and in that will, there was a house, not the one I grew up in, but an old property near the coast, one he had bought with his own money, long before any of us existed to him. He left it to me, not to my uncle, not to my elder cousin who had been groomed his entire life to inherit everything, not even to my father, his own son, to me. I remember the day the lawyer read it out loud. The room went so quiet you could hear the ceiling fan creak. My uncle's jaw tightened. My cousin's face turned the color of ash. My mother squeezed my hand under the table, and I thought foolishly that it was a squeeze of pride. I thought she was happy for me. I was wrong about that too. For the next few weeks everything looked normal, too normal if I'm being honest with myself now. My aunt started inviting me over for tea more often. My cousin, who hadn't said 3 sentences to me in the last 2 years, suddenly wanted to know everything about my college classes, my friends, my plans. My uncle started calling me Betta, in that syrupy voice he never used before. At the time, I told myself that maybe grief was making them kinder. Maybe losing my grandfather had softened something in them. I wanted so badly to believe that. I wanted my family to be good people, because believing otherwise felt like losing the ground under my feet. Then came my birthday. They planned a party. A big one. Balloons in the colors I loved, a cake with my name written in gold icing, relatives I hadn't seen in years suddenly showing up with gifts and warm hugs. My mother wore the necklace my grandfather gave her on her wedding day. My father gave a speech about how proud he was of the woman I had become. Everyone clapped. Everyone smiled. I remember standing in the middle of that living room, surrounded by people who shared my last name, and thinking, for the first time in months, that maybe I finally had my family back. I didn't know that party had nothing to do with me at all. I didn't know that while I was blowing out 20 candles and making a wish I truly believed in, there was a folder sitting in my father's study, filled with documents that had my signature on them. A signature I never gave. I didn't know that somewhere in that house, while I was laughing with my cousins over cake, my uncle was on the phone with a man named Rizwan, a property dealer with a reputation for making inconvenient inheritances simply disappear. I didn't know that the necklace my mother wore that night, the one from my grandfather, was going to be the very last kind thing she ever gave me. Because 3 days later, everything changed. 3 days later, I opened my email and found a message from a bank I had never used, about an account I never opened, containing a transfer I never authorized. A transfer of the exact amount the coastal property was valued at, sent to a name I didn't recognize. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped my phone twice trying to call the bank. And when I finally understood what had happened, when I connected every strange smile, every unexpected phone call, every sudden warmth from people who hadn't looked twice at me in years, I realized the birthday party wasn't a celebration. It was a distraction. They needed me distracted, happy, unsuspecting, while they signed away what my grandfather had given me with his final breath of trust in this world. And the cruelest part wasn't the money. It wasn't even the house. The cruelest part was realizing that my own mother had known. She had known while she hugged me. She had known while she cut the cake. She had known while she looked me in the eyes and told me she loved me. I sat alone in my room that night, staring at that email, feeling something inside me crack in a way I didn't have words for yet. I wanted to scream, I wanted to cry. But more than anything, I wanted answers. What I didn't know yet, what I couldn't have possibly imagined, was that this betrayal was only the beginning. Because what my family did next would not just cost me a bout. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the floor of my room with my back against the bed, staring at that email until the words stopped making sense and started looking like shapes. A transfer, a signature, a name I had never heard in my life. I kept refreshing my inbox like the message would somehow change if I looked at it enough times, like maybe it was a mistake, maybe the bank had confused me with someone else. But deep down in that quiet, ugly part of myself that always sees the truth before the rest of me is ready to accept it, I already knew. This wasn't a mistake, this was a plan, and plans like this don't happen overnight. They take patience. They take people who know exactly how to smile at you while they're taking everything you have. The next morning, I did something I had never done before in that house. I didn't ask questions out loud, I watched. I watched my mother make chai the same way she always did, humming some old song under her breath like nothing in the world was wrong. I watched my father read the newspaper at the table, occasionally glancing at his phone and typing quick replies before locking the screen and setting it face down. I watched my uncle walk in for breakfast, which was strange, because he never came for breakfast, not once in the 2 years since he moved 4 streets away. He sat across from me, buttered his toast, and asked how I was feeling after my birthday, like he hadn't just spent that same week helping steal a house out from under me. That's when I understood something important. If I confronted them without proof, they would simply deny everything. My mother would cry. My father would get angry and turn the story around, making it about my disrespect instead of their betrayal. My uncle would play innocent, the concerned relative just trying to help manage things. After grandfather's passing, I had seen this family rewrite history before. I had watched them turn my grandfather's own words against him after he died, whispering that his final years had made him confused, that his decisions couldn't fully be trusted, that surely he hadn't meant to leave everything to a granddaughter who was, in their words, still just a child. I wasn't a child anymore, not after that email. So instead of confronting them, I started collecting. I remembered my grandfather's oldest friend, a lawyer named Mr. Osan, who had handled his affairs for over 30 years. He was the one who read the will that day, the one who had looked at me with something like sadness when the room went quiet. I called him that afternoon from the rooftop, where no one could hear me. My voice was shaking so badly I had to say the same sentence 3 times before it made sense. He listened. He didn't interrupt once. And when I finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line before he said something I will never forget. I was wondering when you would call me. He told me he had suspected something the moment my uncle requested. Copy of the property documents for safekeeping. Less than a week after the funeral, he told me my grandfather had once pulled him aside, months before he passed, and said, "If anything strange happens with that coastal property, you make sure my granddaughter knows the truth. Promise me that." At the time, Mr. Osan thought it was simply an old man being cautious. Now he understood it was a warning. He asked me to meet him the next day, away from the house, away from anyone who might report back to my family. He told me to bring my ID, my grandfather's original letters if I had any, and to say absolutely nothing to anyone until we spoke in person. I remember hanging up the phone and standing on that rooftop for a long time, looking down at the same street I had played in as a child, the same gate my father used to lift me over when I was too small to climb it myself. Everything looked the same, nothing was the same. That evening at dinner, my mother asked me why I was so quiet. I told her I wasn't feeling well. She reached over and touched my forehead, checking for fever, the same way she had done 100 times when I was a little girl and got sick. Her hand was warm, her eyes looked worried, and for one terrible, confusing second, I almost believed she really cared. Then I remembered the necklace. I remembered her wearing it while she knew. I excused myself early and went to my room, locking the door for the first time in years. I pulled out an old shoebox where I kept letters my grandfather had written me over the years. Birthday cards, notes he'd leave under my pillow, a long letter he wrote me the summer I turned 16, telling me that one day I would understand why he trusted me the way he did. I read that letter 3 times that night, tracing his handwriting with my finger like it could somehow protect me from what was coming. I didn't know yet how deep this went. I didn't know that the property wasn't the only thing they had already touched, or that Mr. Asan had documents waiting for me that would reveal names I never expected to see. Names that would make me question not just my family's loyalty, but everything I thought I understood about my own life. I only knew one thing for certain as I turned off the lights that night. Tomorrow, everything was going to change, and this time, I wasn't going to be the one distracted by cake and candles. The next morning, I told my mother I was going out to meet a friend. It was the first real lie I had ever told her, and it came out of my mouth so smoothly that it frightened me a little. Not because I felt guilty. Because I didn't. Something in me had shifted overnight, quietly and permanently, the way a bone sets crooked if you don't fix it in time. I was no longer the girl who told her mother everything. I had become someone who understood that in this house, honesty was a weapon, and I could no longer afford to hand mine over for free. Mr. Asan's office was small, tucked above a fabric shop on a street I had passed 100 times without ever noticing it. The stairs creaked under my feet as I climbed them, my heart pounding harder with every step, like my body already knew I was walking towards something that would break me open before it healed me. He was waiting at his desk when I walked in, an old wooden desk covered in files that looked like they hadn't been touched in years, except for one folder placed carefully at the very front. My folder. My grandfather's folder. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He slid the folder toward me and said, "Before you look at this, I need you to understand something. What you're about to see is going to hurt. But I would rather you hear the truth from me than keep living in a house built on lies." I opened it with shaking hands. The first thing I found was a copy of the transfer request, the one connected to the email I had received. My signature was there, at the bottom, in blue ink. It looked exactly like mine, almost exactly, but I had signed enough school documents, enough bank forms, enough college applications to know my own signature the way I knew my own face. The loop on the S was wrong round. Too careful. Like someone had practiced it. Mr. Asan said quietly, watching my face. "Professionally done but forged. I had it compared against 3 verified samples from your college records." I felt something cold settle into my stomach. It's one thing to suspect betrayal. It's another to hold physical proof of it in your own hands, ink and paper confirming that someone sat down, practiced your name, and signed away your future like it was nothing more than a grocery list. Then he showed me the second document. A power of attorney form, dated 2 weeks after my grandfather's funeral, granting my uncle temporary authority over the coastal property on behalf of the family, pending final asset distribution. My name was on that one too, forged again. But it was the third document that broke something in me completely. It was a text message thread printed and stapled together, retrieved, Mr. Asan explained carefully, from a phone that had briefly passed through his office for an unrelated matter involving my uncle's business dealings months earlier. Before any of this began, he hadn't gone looking for it. He had simply remembered it when the pieces started falling into place, and he'd gone back through his old records to confirm what his instincts were already telling him. The messages were between my uncle and my mother. I sat there, reading words my own mother had written, words that confirmed she had known about the plan from the very beginning, not just known. Participated. There was a message from her, dated the week before my birthday party, that said, "Let's just make sure she has a good day. Once everything is signed, none of this will matter to her anyway. She's young, she'll move on." Those 3 words hurt more than the forged signatures, more than the stolen property, more than all of it combined, because it meant that every hug, every "I love you," every warm smile at that party wasn't just a lie. It was a strategy. She had looked at her own daughter and calculated exactly how much heartbreak I could absorb before I would simply accept the loss and stay quiet, the way good daughters are taught to stay quiet in families like mine. I don't remember crying in that office. I remember feeling strangely calm, the way the sky goes quiet right before a storm breaks. Mr. Asan waited until I looked up before he spoke again. "There's one more thing," he said. "Something your grandfather asked me to keep sealed unless a situation exactly like this one occurred." He reached into a drawer and pulled out an envelope with my name, written on it in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a letter, dated almost a year before he passed away. "My dear child," it began, "if you are reading this, it means the people I hoped would prove me wrong have proven me right instead. I want you to know that the property was never really about the property. It was a test. One I hoped, with everything in me, that they would fail quietly and you would never have to witness. But if things have gone differently, if they have shown you who they truly are, then it is time you knew something else. Something I should have told you while I was still alive. The letter stopped there. On that page, Mr. Asan explained, almost apologetically, that the second page had been sealed separately, to be given to me only once I had fully understood and accepted everything in the first envelope. A precaution my grandfather insisted on, saying I would need time to absorb one truth before I was ready for the next. I looked up at him, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's in the second page?" He met my eyes, and for the first time since I had walked into that office, I saw something that looked almost like fear. "Something about your father," he said. "Something that changes everything you think you know about why this family wanted that property so badly in the first place. Something about your father." Those 4 words sat in the air of that small office like smoke, refusing to clear, refusing to let me breathe normally again. I asked Mr. Asan to give me the second page right then, but he shook his head slowly, almost sadly, and told me my grandfather had been very specific about this. The second page wasn't meant to be read in a lawyer's office under fluorescent lights, with someone watching my face for a reaction. It was meant to be read alone, somewhere quiet, somewhere I could fall apart if I needed to without an audience. He told me to go home, to act normal for a few more days, to gather enough emotional strength to face whatever was written on that page. He said my grandfather trusted his timing in life, and he wanted me to trust it too, even now, even after everything. I hated that answer. I wanted the truth immediately, the way you want water when you're dying of thirst. But something in his voice made me listen. Maybe it was respect for a dead man who had never once in 18 years given me a reason not to trust him. So I went home, and for 3 days, I became the best actress that house had ever seen. I laughed at my cousin's jokes at dinner. I let my mother braid my hair the way she used to when I was small, even though every touch of her fingers against my scalp felt like static against an old wound. I even let my uncle pat my shoulder and tell me how resilient I was being about grandfather's passing, biting down so hard on my own tongue that I tasted blood, just to keep myself from screaming the word forgery into his smug, satisfied face. But behind that performance, I wasn't idle. I used those 3 days to quietly move copies of every document Mr. Asan had given me into 3 separate places: a locker at my college, a trusted friend's house across town, and a cloud folder protected by a password none of them would ever guess. I wasn't going to let this family destroy evidence the way they had already tried to destroy the truth. On the 4th night, I told my mother I was staying at my friend Heine's house for the weekend to study for exams. She barely looked up from her phone when she said okay. I remember thinking, with a strange, hollow ache, that even her carelessness in that moment felt like relief. It was easier to leave a house that didn't seem to notice me leaving. I didn't go to Hina's house. I went to a small guest house Mr. Asan had recommended, 2 streets from his office, run by an old friend of his who asked no questions and required no ID beyond a name I made up on the spot. I sat on the edge of a stiff, unfamiliar bed, the envelope resting in my lap, and I stared at it for almost 20 minutes before I found the courage to open it. The second page began differently than the first, less gentle, more urgent, like my grandfather had written it in a hurry, afraid he might not have enough time left to say what needed to be said. "My dear child," it read, "the coastal property was never simply a gift, it was a shield. Years ago, before you were even born, your father made a decision that nearly destroyed this family, not through cruelty, but through debt. He borrowed heavily from men who do not forgive missed payments the way banks do. I paid off that debt quietly, over many years, and in exchange, I asked for only one promise, that he would never touch what I built for you. He agreed. But promises made under shame rarely survive the temptation of opportunity. I had to stop reading. My hands were shaking so badly the paper crinkled loudly in the silence of that room. My father, who had stood up at my birthday party and given a speech about how proud he was of me, had a history I never knew about. One buried so deep that even my mother, based on everything I'd read so far, might not have fully understood the roots of it. I kept reading. The men your father borrowed from years ago resurfaced after my death. Aware that a valuable property had just entered the family, I believe your uncle did not act alone in convincing your parents to move forward with this plan. I believe he used your father's old debt as leverage, threatening to expose it publicly, to their business partners, to people whose respect your father has spent his whole life chasing. I do not say this to excuse what they have done to you. I say this so you understand the true shape of the trap you have found yourself in. This was never only about greed, it is about fear, and frightened people, my darling girl, do far crueler things than greedy ones ever could. I sat there, letter trembling in my lap, feeling something inside me shift from heartbreak into something colder, sharper, more focused. My father hadn't just gone along with a scheme out of weakness. He had been cornered, manipulated, threatened, and instead of coming to me, instead of trusting me the way his own father had, he had chosen silence and betrayal to protect a secret from his past. The letter ended with one final line that I would replay in my head for the rest of that night, long after I turned off the lamp beside that unfamiliar bed. You now know more about this family than any of them realize. Use that knowledge wisely, not for revenge but for the truth, because the moment they understand you know everything, the debt, the forgery, the fear driving them, is the moment this family's carefully built lies will finally begin to collapse. I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope, my mind already racing ahead to a single, dangerous question. If I knew the truth now, how much longer could I wait before they realized I did? And more importantly, when they found out, what would they be willing to do to keep me quiet? I went back home on Sunday evening, and for the first time since this began, I wasn't afraid of that house anymore. Fear needs uncertainty to survive, and I didn't have any uncertainty left. I knew about the forged signatures. I knew about the power of attorney. I knew about my mother's messages, my uncle's manipulation, and my father's old debt that had turned him into a man willing to betray his own daughter to protect his pride. Knowledge, I realized that weekend, isn't just power, it's armor, and I walked through that front door wearing it like it had been made for me my entire life. I didn't confront them that night. I had learned enough about strategy in the last week to know that anger without a plan is just noise, and noise is easy to dismiss. Instead, I spent the next few days finishing what I had started, working with Mr. Asan to prepare everything properly. Certified copies, notarized statements, a formal complaint drafted and ready to file with the property registrar, along with a separate file prepared for the bank regarding the fraudulent transfer. He also helped me understand something crucial. The men my father owed money to, the ones my grandfather's letter mentioned, were already known to local authorities for predatory lending practices bordering on extortion. That detail alone meant my father had leverage of his own, if he was ever brave enough to use it. But that was his battle to fight, not mine to fight for him. I chose a Sunday for the confrontation, the same day of the week my grandfather used to gather the whole family for lunch when he was still alive. It felt right, somehow, to use that tradition one last time, not to honor them, but to honor him. I waited until we were all seated at the table. My mother had made his favorite dish, karahi gosht, the way she always did on Sundays, as if cooking a dead man's favorite meal could erase what she'd done to his final wish. My father sat at the head of the table, the way he always did, and my uncle had, once again, invited himself over for lunch, a habit that had become far too convenient in the last 2 months. I placed a folder on the table, right beside the serving dish, and I said, calmly, I know everything. The room went silent in a way I will never forget. Not the peaceful silence of a family enjoying a meal together, but the sharp, suffocating silence of people realizing the ground beneath them had just cracked open. I opened the folder and laid out the documents one by one. The forged signature, compared beside 3 genuine samples. The power of attorney dated and stamped. The printed messages between my mother and my uncle, including the line that still made my chest tighten every time I read it. She'll move on. My mother's face went white. My uncle stood up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the floor, already opening his mouth to explain, to twist, to do what he always did best. I didn't let him. I told him, in a voice steadier than I ever thought I could manage, that Mr. Asan already had certified copies filed with the registrar, that the bank had already flagged the fraudulent transfer for investigation, and that if he wanted to avoid a criminal forgery case with his name attached to it, he would sit down and listen instead of talk. He sat down. Then I turned to my father. I didn't show him the letter about his debt. Not yet. I simply looked at him and said, I know why you did this. I know someone used your past against you, and I want you to know that I understand fear makes people do things they aren't proud of." I watched something break behind his eyes. Not anger, but shame, real shame. The kind that had clearly been eating at him long before I ever found out the truth. "But you chose fear over me," I continued. "You chose silence over trust. And that is something I will need time to forgive, if I ever can." My mother reached for my hand across the table, the same way she had the day the will was read, and for a moment, old habits nearly pulled me toward her. But I pulled my hand back gently, and said the only thing that felt true in that moment. "You don't get to hold my hand and hurt me at the same time anymore." In the weeks that followed, the fraudulent transfer was reversed through the bank's investigation. My uncle, faced with the threat of a forgery case that could have destroyed his business reputation entirely, agreed to a formal apology and full restitution rather than risk exposure in court. My father, forced finally to confront the debt he had hidden for so long, went to the authorities himself about the men who had pressured him, choosing, for the first time in this entire story, to face fear instead of running from it. It didn't erase what he had done, but it was at least a beginning. My mother and I are still rebuilding something. I won't pretend it's whole again. Trust, once broken by someone who is supposed to protect you unconditionally, doesn't simply return because the truth came out. It has to be rebuilt slowly, carefully, the way you rebuild anything after it's been shattered, piece by piece, with no guarantee it will ever look exactly the way it used to. The coastal property is mine now, fully and legally, exactly the way my grandfather intended. I visit it sometimes alone, and I sit on the porch overlooking the water, holding both of his letters in my hands. I think about what he wrote in that very first line, a test I hoped they would fail quietly. They failed loudly instead, and in doing so, they taught me something no inheritance ever could. That the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally aren't always the ones who do. Sometimes the truest loyalty you'll ever find is the kind an old man leaves behind in ink, trusting that even after he's gone, you'll be strong enough to uncover it, face it, and survive it. I did survive it. And I will never let anyone make that mistake with me again.